Snow clung to her lashes and froze there, tiny white irons that stung with every blink. Theon held her hand so tightly his knuckles ached. But if he loosened his grip even an inch, the dark would gulp her down, and he would be left alone with the wind and the dogs and his own name. He could feel it breathing behind them. Reek, a ghost with a knife made of winter. He forced his boots through drifts that swallowed his shins, forced his lungs to labor when they wanted only to burn, forced the voice into silence. The girl, no girl at all in truth, he knew that now, Jane not Arya, stumbled and half fell, and he dragged her up, cursing and coaxing by turns. The air tasted like ice and old wood smoke. Somewhere behind, a horn blew once, twice. The dogs found a cry and made a chorus of it. Not far, he gasped, though he could not have said what lay ahead but the blinding storm. Keep close. Keep. Gods, keep. Please, she whispered, voice raw with cold. Please, I can't see. Neither can I, he told her. And then the snow under his boot vanished and his leg plunged through a thin crust into water hot as blood. He jerked back with a yelp. The springs, he thought, lurching. Winterfell breathed warm beneath its skin even in weather like this, sent its steam up like sighs. That warmth and no more was what dared the snow to melt here and make treachery where men expected solid ground. It reminded him how near the walls they still were. Dogs and horns and men bellowing, and Theon Greyjoy, who had once laughed as he rode, stumbled along the half-frozen channel with a girl who trembled so hard her teeth knocked together. The gate had been behind them when they leapt. He could still feel the shake of the stone under his soles, hear the spearwifes shout, smell the blood. He could feel the air part as bodies passed, as arrows passed, as luck passed. But he had fallen into snow that closed soft around him as a grave, and he had stood and run and not looked back, because that was the courage he had left. The wind shifted. He saw, through the sleet, a blur of something darker than the snow. Trees, a copse where the storms broke a little. He took her toward it, half dragging, half carrying, his thighs cursing him. The barks of the dogs grew louder, nearer. A horn boomed and rolled across the white like thunder. Faster, he said, breath of fine mist in front of him, and the girl nodded without lifting her head. Branches took them in and clawed at cloaks, and then there were men in the branches. He froze so completely snow gathered itself on his shoulders like a new cloak. He saw black shapes with bows, a flash of weak lamplight on steel, a flurry of ice from a branch as someone shifted. Down, a voice called through snow. On your knees if they're not frozen. Theon swallowed. He could not have said what kindness or cruelty stood in front of him. Men in the north had many faces and most of them were carved sharp. He sank, and the girl beside him followed with a small noise, as if even her bones were protesting. A man slid from a tree as silent as a stoat. He was tall and thick through the shoulders, with a frost-stiff gray beard and one eye milk-white. A patch of red wool wrapped the top of his boot where leather had split. The wool had been dyed once, faded now to the color of old meat. He looked Theon over and spat into the snow. Greyjoy, he said, as if greeting a piece of driftwood that had washed up too many times. Reek, they called you. Less stink on you tonight. His one good eye shifted to the girl. And that's no wolf I see. She's a weeping girl with ink scratches where there were none before. Someone's pretty lie. A cold night for lies. Lord Umber, Theon said hoarsely. Crowfood. The big man's beard twitched. Aye, more's when I've more patience than teeth. He peered back past them into the storm. You've a pack at your heels. The bastard, Theon said. He'll come. He never lets go. He heard the reek voice in that word, the bastard, with its quiver of terror. He set his jaw. Ramsay. He's behind us with his dogs. He couldn't say escaped. He wasn't sure they had. We fell. We fought. We ran. The girl had begun to sob without sound, air shaking in and out. Crowfood grunted, perhaps not unkindly. And here you fell into my snare, he said. H&H, the gods are drunk tonight. Now, quick, we know this wood and your hunters don't. That's for the best. You walk quiet, you live. You fall, you die. That heavy enough for those heads of yours?" Theon almost laughed, came out thin and aching. "Aye." A hand reached down from a branch and pulled the girl up. Another hauled Theon by his armpit like a sack. They moved through the copse, a thread of shadows. Theon caught the reek of smoked meat, the subtle warmth of a hidden fire the trees and the storm swallowed whole. The men were all in furs and bits of mail that glinted once like fish bellies, then went black again. The wind shifted and the dog's baying swung away with it, fainting. "You know the woods?" Theon whispered to the umber as they went, picking their steps along roots and ice. "You know a way to—" "I," the old man said, "I know a way to a king." A king. For an instant Theon's mouth filled with salt and long voyages and gray waves under a slate sky. He tasted home and the ash of it. He bit down on his lip and tasted blood instead. The North had a king now, a hard man with a clenched jaw who looked at heating stones like lazy servants. Theon had heard his name in refusals, in rumors, in frightened whispers from servants who had to pour wine for Freys and pretend not to tremble. Stannis had come with a red priestess and taken castles by decree and the stubborn bone of will. Then he had taken to the snow and vanished like a smoke. "Quiet," Crowfoot muttered. "Footing here's a cursed wife." He put a hand on Theon's shoulder and guided him around a drift that was beneath a hollow. Theon's foot slid and he caught. His weight, teeth clacking, and then they were moving again, the dogs now too far to guess their number. The trees thinned. Theon saw darkness in a different shape, bulk long and low. A longhouse, half buried in snow. No torches on its outside, no smoke issuing from its roof hole. But within, when a man padded to a door and made 3 quick knocks and 2 slower, when a bar lifted, there was heat and the smell of men and oil and wool wet from the weather. They were hauled inside with a quiet efficiency that spoke not of fear but of practice. And for a moment Theon swayed in the sudden warmth and had to catch himself on a plank. The room was half full of men with beards rimed in white, huddled over maps burned black on the edges from closeness to candle flames. At the far end, a man in a plain brown wool cloak sat on an overturned barrel. His hair was thinning and pulled back, his mouth a straight line. He was a king the way a knife was a king. Theon knew him in an instant. Stannis Baratheon's eyes fell on the girl first, taking measure, then on Theon like a cold iron. "They said a prize had fallen into our lap," he said, his voice quiet and flat. "I see now the hand that threw it." Theon opened his mouth and found his words had frozen in his throat. He forced them out like splinters. "Your Grace," he said, because that cost him nothing and it was the only coin he had left. "I have a thing you might want. 2 things. Jane swayed beside him. He steadied her with a hand. Stannis extended a hand and his steward placed a goblet in it, then took it away again when the king did not raise it to drink. Theon saw the twitch of Stannis's eye at his own hand and knew the man fought himself even in small things. "Say them," Stannis said, "and if I deem them worth the breath, I may let you have more." Theon swallowed. The hot air made his chest hurt worse than the cold had. "Ramsay Bolton rides with his hounds," he said. "He will be upon us if we tarry. If you want him dead, you can have him. If you want Winterfell, I know its bones. I know how the springs run and where they pool. I know how to open a door that no one uses." He paused. "And he couldn't say Arya. On her shivering face, the tears were salt trails cutting through frost. "She is not what they say. Nobolf. The Boltons made a lie to sit Winterfell." The room had gone so still the snow shifting on the roof was loud. Men who had been huddled near the map straightened. Crowfoot's eye gleamed. Stannis did not move at all. "Who is she?" he asked after a heartbeat. "Jane Poole," she whispered, tiny. "My father kept accounts for Lord Eddard Stark. He died." She lowered her eyes. "They made me. They said I was Arya. They—" She closed her mouth and clamped her teeth. She would not cry here, in front of men who measured worth by how much you gave to the snows. Stannis nodded once, a bare dip of his chin. "A mockery and a crime," he said. He looked to Theon again, and Theon felt cold despite the sweat trickling down his spine. "You speak of doors and bones. Speak plain. It came to Theon like a map unrolling itself in his mind. A map he had hated and loved and prowled for a boy's glory and a man's treachery. The water brings warmth, he said. It runs from the Godswood under the North Keep and past the kitchens to the granaries and to the old tunnels Lord Ricard sealed when he built his new walls. There's a sluice where they drain the pools in summer. It was used to carry waste once, and to bring in casks in times of siege. It opens into the Wolfswood under an old oak that looks like a giant's hand clutching at nothing. Postern lies not far beyond. In snow like this, men search the gates and forget the places that are not gates at all. And you know how to open it. No question, only statement. I, Theon said, with a key I do not have, but a bolt I can pry if I find the right end of it. The timber swells, but a mended hand can still pull. He looked down at his fingers and the white scars where nails had been. He did not look long. Stannis's lips pressed together until they looked bloodless. Good, he said. We hunt the bastard first. Without him, the father's grip on the nettle loosens. He rose, motion crisp, a man at his side. His knight with the narrow eyes, Theon thought, the one who walked as if the world were a cramp. Folded the map and thrust it into a leather tube. Lord Umber, Stannis said, take 30 and make noise west. Draw the dogs if you can. Gladly, Crowfoot growled. The old man's good eye sparkled like the point of an icicle. I'll give them a trail to trip on. Sir Clayton, Stannis said to a lean man with snow still clinging to his mustaches. You hold this place with 20. Send word to Ser Godry and those fat men of White Harbor that the wolf girl is no wolf. Wyman Manderly feeds himself on hope as well as pies. Give him a piece. Your Grace, the man replied, bowing. Stannis looked back to Theon, and Theon saw in that glance a thing like judgment already past. You will take me to this oak that clutches at empty air, the king said. If you lied, I cut out your tongue and be done with the lies. If you told the truth, you may spit one wrong into the snow and call it penance. You mean his name, someone said behind Theon with a snort. The men barked a thin, cold laughter that held no mirth. Theon swallowed hard and nodded. They left the warmth for the white. Men muffled their faces and shoulders, took up spears and axes, checked bowstrings like men who had learned what snow did to unguarded gut. They moved in a column broken and knotted by trees, Crowfoot slipping away with his band to make the noise a man like Ramsay would be too proud to ignore. Theon walked close by Stannis, not because the king offered comfort. There was none in him, but because you stayed near the flame you feared you might mend yourself in. He kept the girl wrapped in a cloak someone had thrust at her. She moved, like a piece of glass wind had forgotten to push. A woman with a scar pulling one corner of her mouth down. Asha Greyjoy's face looked at him from memory, and he flinched before he realized it was only a memory. Asha was somewhere in the snow, wearing iron and chains. Theon breathed hard and put his face down. They found the first hound's prints before they heard the dog. The tracks were like coins scattered in a game, sliding over one another, running this way and that. Crowfoot had left a trail. You could tell by the blood on the snow. Hairs caught in a bramble where he had shaved some unlucky's arm with his axe, perhaps, to make the smell that called to dogs. Theon heard a yelp, distant, then snarls. A horn bellowed and was cut off. Stannis lifted a hand and crouched. Men crouched with him. 3 slid forward like stones rolling down a slope. It happened quick, much quicker than the years it had taken to build the fear up in Theon's head. The dogs burst into a clearing in a long, ragged crescent, tongues scarlet, eyes like damp coal. Behind them came men with spears and crossbows and furs that did not quite match in cut or cleanliness. They were laughing before they had the measure of the thing they'd found. The noise they had followed cracked back on them as Crowfoot's 30 rose up from the drift like anger. The snow made it all soft and muffled. The dogs bayed, men grunted, steel clicked on steel. Theon could not see Ramsay. For a horrible instant he thought the bastard was a shape the snow made, a storm that walked. Then he saw him. A leather hood thrown back despite the weather, hair wet and dark. A face red from wind with teeth bared as if laughter had ripped them that way and left them. His bow was in his hand and a knife hung like a promise at his belt. Stannis did not shout a challenge. He did not announce himself with trumpets like a Southron fool in a song. He raised 2 fingers and men at his flanks moved as if a wire were tied to their spines, taking the clearing's edge, slipping through scrub, circling. The dogs broke left, then right, chasing the Umber men as they pretended to flee. Ramsay put 2 arrows into 2 backs before he understood that he had been led into the one place the ground did not want him. The lake lay beyond the next thin line of trees, a dull slate full of black bones. The snow hid the place where the reeds grew thinner, where a runnel of warm water bubbled up thinly to soften the ice from below. The Umber men had stomped paths across it for their own feet, packed thick and safe, then brushed snow over the places beyond. Ramsay charged across, 3 dogs at his heels, boots slamming, a grin like a cut. The grin went away when the ice beneath him creaked, then cracked, then snapped with a sound like a man's back breaking. He went in hard, water up to his waist and then to his neck as the broken piece of ice he scrabbled at slid away between his gloves. He clutched at the edge with 1 hand, dropped his bow, grabbed with 2. He was strong. He would be, Theon thought with a shudder. Cruelty took muscle, but the ice in his beard and lashes made a mask of him. A dog tried to leap the gap to reach a fleeing Umber man and went plunging, legs flailing frantically and then vanishing. Ramsay made a sound then that sounded nothing like a laugh. 2 of his men reached for him and the ice broke beneath them too and went to teeth. Stannis stood like a man watching the sea take an old pier. He lifted a hand, the same measured gesture, and crossbows hummed. One of Ramsay's men was struck in the cheek and spun. Another doubled and spewed blood onto the ice that froze as it spread. Crowfoot bellowed with savage joy and leapt the broken edge where the stomping paths held. He sliced at a wrist that came up from the dark, and the hand beneath it let go and went away on the current like a pale fish. A man with a tufted beard tried to drag Ramsay by his fur collar. The fur tore free from its seams. Ramsay's face went under, came up, spat water in a curse thick with panic. In his eyes Theon saw, for the first time, the boy the bastard had been at Roose Bolton's knee, a boy who had learned the wrong lesson every time. The water took him anyway. It slid over his mouth and nose, and he tried to hold himself up by sheer rage. He did not manage it. He slid down, kicking. His knife, the little curved one he had liked to toy with, flashed once at the surface, and then it too was gone. There was no cheer. There was only the sound of men's breath pluming in the cold and the groans of the unlucky trapped in the black as their hands slowed and stopped and let go. Crowfoot waded out along the packed path, axe in hand, and peered into the dark as if whoever lay down there might come up with a new treachery. "Well?" he muttered to the water, as if to an old debt paid late, and lifted his chin towards Stannis. "That's 1 wolfhound drowned." Stannis's jaw flexed once. "Gather what dogs live," he said. "They know this ground and we do not. Feed those that we need. Kill the rest." He turned to Theon, and for a moment, the briefest Theon could remember, there was something like mercy behind his eyes. It might have been the steam rising off the black gape in the ice. "You've bought a little time," he said, "and a little more than that." He looked to the men. "We go to the oak." They did not tarry to harvest ears or strip the dead. The Umber men pocketed what oil flasks they could and a few knives, took a brace of shivering dogs that would heal when called, and left the rest to the snow and the water. The sky had a leaden look by then, day being a thing not so much that you had as that the dark grudgingly surrendered for a time. Theon stumbled along, numb from knees to soles and skin to skull. He thought of the dogs that would find the bodies in spring and dig, men who would come here with hooks when the thaw made the lake spit up its dead. He thought of Ramsay's face as it went under. He felt no joy. He felt only a loosening, as if a rope tied around his chest had frayed. He wouldn't say the name. Not now. Not yet. Not where the ghosts could hear. The oak waited where he remembered it. Its branches warped into a hand with 5 crooked fingers, a snaggle thing that had scared him as a boy and made him throw rocks at it and laugh afterward. It looked the same, only older, which was how everything looked now. Snow had packed itself into creases and sat like meat on the bones of it. The hill it grew on was a hummock under the white. Theon went to his knees and plunged his hands into snow until he found the muscle memory in fingers he did not quite trust. 3 quick scrapes to find the hidden plank, a pry of the nails that had rusted since he last loosened them, a push with the heel of his hand when wood swelled. Stannis stood above him. The men had gathered in a crescent, their breaths making a fog all their own. A man close by Theon bent and pulled up the plank when his own grip failed. Theon worked the bolt with the flat of his knife and felt it give with a groan. "Careful," he breathed. "There's a drop." He slid himself forward and felt for the rung he knew to be there. His fingers found wet wood and a slickness of algae harder than any ice. He went down into the earth like a thing returning to its hole. The heat came up to meet him. He had forgotten the shock of it. In winter, even small warmth was a galling thing. This was like stepping into the open mouth of some stone beast that had rested too long by a hearth. Steam beaded on his lashes and ran. For a moment he thought he would weep, and then he realized it was only that. He stood in a tunnel whose walls had been brick 100 years ago and were now half-eaten by time and wet. He put a hand on the wall and it came away slick. He found the second rung and sat his weight onto it. Then the third, then was down and standing on stone with the outrageous pleasure of feeling it warm through his boot leather. Stannis dropped after him like an iron thing fallen from an anvil, and then another man and another. The light Stannis carried turned the steam into ghosts. "You have the way?" Stannis asked, as if Theon had not led him to it already. He wasn't being cruel, Theon realized. He was a man who never believed he had a thing until his hand closed on it. "Yes," Theon said. "Follow the sound. The drains empty into a pool in the Godswood. It will stink of earth. The stones sweat there. We take the side run where the sweating slows." He set his jaw. "Keep low. The shafts carry sound." He knew that from childhood and from nights he had crept for the delight of hearing things he should not. The crunch of an apple as a kitchen girl stole, the mutter of Lord Eddard's voice in conference with men whose names had become a litany of dead, the cry of a woman in the guest house. He shoved that all away and walked. The tunnel had been cleaned poorly and long ago. A man could tell by the uneven scum on its edges and the way the stones were worn where a hand had helped itself down a bank. Theon let his palm drag as a way to feel his way in the fog, and because it made him think of the boys who had done the same a lifetime ago. One had broken his ankle here trying a jump his friend had dared him to. Theon had laughed then. Laughed because he'd feared the shame of not laughing more than he'd feared the gods. Now the gods waited just ahead in a grove of pale bark and bloody leaves and would not find the joke so keen. They took a bend, then another. The steam cleared and the sound of moving water grew louder. Theon breathed shallowly through his mouth. Stannis did not bother to hide his breath. He had no use for discomfort except to nail it to a wall. The pool in the Godswood was as he remembered it, a black mirror under branches. He crouched by a stone lip and saw his face ghosting on it. The same and not the same, hair thin and stubble showing, skin mottled with cold and heat. He put his fingers into the pool and felt its unnatural warmth. He stood and led the way along the wall to a rougher tunnel, one less loved by the springs. Here the stones were cold enough to stick. Men reached out and then yanked his skin, wanted to hold. Someone hissed. Theon kept his eyes on the damp bricks. When he reached another grate, he stopped and crouched. He felt for the catch. When he found it, it was rust and flakes, and his hands bled before it moved. He pressed his mouth shut so no sound escaped. Iron squealed. Men froze and held their breath until the dead thing's voice was finished. Then they moved again, stepping through. The tunnel gave onto a crawl that stank of stale air and rat nests. Theon went first because it was his trained degradation, and because he would not put the king first into a hole that narrowed. He wanted to do something that cost him. He dragged himself, elbows and knees, and when his elbow scraped, it was almost a relief to have a pain he understood. His hand hit wood. He pushed. It didn't move. He felt for the hinge, the old hinge, made when Lord Rickard still had dreams, and shoved at it the other way. This time the plank lifted. He looked up and saw darkness, then the faint outline of barrels, vast and gentle and round as sleeping pigs. It was the wine store. All the kitchens had long been raided and raided again by now, he guessed, but a king's kitchens never forgot the barrels farthest back. He slid himself into the room, stood, and breathed the heady ghost of warmth and stale wine and stale wheat and men's presence. He listened. In the distance he heard a shout, so faint it might have been a man in a dream. The whole castle groaned softly in the cold like a ship in a winter tide. He turned and helped haul Stannis after him. The king stood in the yellow of the hooded lantern and looked, and what he saw he filed away. Men came up and found their feet with a roll of knees and shoulders. "From here," Stannis murmured. "Theoness." Hut his eyes and let his head lean toward where the weak warmth snuck through the stones and into his bones. He pictured the space above, the scullery to the right with its taps frozen, the servants' passage up a short flight to the buttery, then the corridor where the hall spilled visitors, then the outer door to the yard. Beyond that, the kitchens. Beyond that, the gods would. The heart tree leaning like an old storyteller over its pool's mist. He pictured where men would be at this hour. Frey's dicing in corners, Roos's maester moving as quiet as a snake, Wyman's men fat and pretending at sloth, Lady Dustin's eyes sharp as rabbit wire, the Riswells with their voices too careful. Roose would be at his board, measuring portions that mattered and tossing the ones that did not to the snow. "Left," Theon said softly. "Then up. Then a door we can lift if we're careful. And then there's a hearth that drains our stink. Then we dress other men." He opened his eyes and looked at Stannis. "If you want this done with knives at throats and no drum of boots to waken them all." "I do," Stannis said. He took a breath in through his nose and his mouth did something that wasn't a smile and wasn't not a smile. "You've some use left in you." Theon did not say that use and worth were two different sums. He moved. They came up into the scullery like ghosts rising from a grave, and for a moment he felt like a child again, hiding here with a stolen roll while a cook's back was turned. The kitchen just beyond hummed and clanked despite the hour, because Winterfell devoured fires as a ship devours rope, and men at war were always hungry. A boy sat on a stool staring at a pot, nodding. A woman with gray at her hairline and a scar across her lip took his spoon and banged it on the rim of the pot. It was almost home, in a perverse way. Theon slipped past, kept to the shadows, and brought the men up in twos and threes. Stannis's lordlings went with him because he was the man with the map in his head, and no one seemed to find that hard to accept for the moment. The boy's eyes drooped and jerked open and drooped again. The woman tasted with the spoon and nodded to herself. Theon's heart beat so hard his whole body felt like a drum, but he did not stumble. They found garments, coats with fry blue on the cuffs, caps with foxtails. They found spears stacked by a door. They found a guard dozing with his hand around his shaft as if it were a wife that had disappointed him. Theon put a hand over his mouth and pulled his head back and put the knife in, and the man died without ever quite waking up. He did it because it had to be done and because he was good at it. The knowledge struck him like a hand. He swallowed it whole. In the yard, the cold braced them, made their faces a burn. The sky had that greasy pre-dawn look that winter wore when it was about to change things. Snow had clumped on the stones and the drifts had the smoothness of a cat's thigh. It would be treacherous. Theon walked under the eaves and let the shadow take him. Stannis moved like someone who had never worn shadow in his life and had found a use for it at last. They split like thieves when they reached the yard, each pair with a task. Theon went toward the east side, where the old armory stood, and beyond it the tower that had known more ghosts than he'd had lies. The gods would lay beyond, and his feet wanted to turn, to take him into trees that would not judge because their judgment was all already past. He forced himself to the tower because a man he had been, no, because a man he would be, had to see certain rooms again. He took 3 steps up and stopped with his heart lodged somewhere between throat and teeth. He had not thought there would be a woman standing in the passage with 2 wolfhounds at her knees. He certainly had not thought she would wear a gown of black wool and a necklace hung with small brown bones and look at him as if she had known to expect him at precisely this moment. She had hair gone to silver and eyes the color of ash on the ends of a fire. She considered him for a heartbeat and said, "The gods have interesting humor." "Lady Dustin," he said. "Once," she replied. and made a small gesture with her fingers that both dogs obeyed without a sound. They sank to their bellies. The passage behind her held two men with crossbows whose faces looked accustomed to the idea of murder. "The bastard?" she asked. He swallowed. "Drowned," he said. He did not say where, and he did not say who had watched it. A ghost of satisfaction passed through her eyes like a fish through dark water. "My lord will be put out," she said. It was impossible to tell if she meant Roose or some old lord planted in the cold earth. Her tone ran like a knife over leather. "And you came back to show him the door that should have remained forgotten." "I came back to put a king in his hall," he said. His voice surprised him by being steady. She tilted her head. "Which king?" she asked, and then smiled, and the bones of her necklace moved. "It hardly matters. The North does not like being governed by men who do not understand snow." She gestured faintly with one hand, and her crossbowman eased the strings back a finger, then let them rest again. "Go," she said, "before Roose's men sniff you and chew your hamstrung legs like pigs will do. The gods are loud tonight. See if your king is listening." He went. He did not look back to see if she followed, and she did not. In the yard he saw a shape just inside the gate lift a horn and then lower it again, as if thinking better. He saw a man in fry colors look up from a piss and frown into the odd quality of the air that came before dawn. He saw Wyman Manderley, round and pale with pale eyes and a fur collar that looked like a bear had misplaced itself, move along the wall with a stride that belied his bulk. "Lord Wyman," Theon said on reflex, because he had always said Lord when a man had that weight, and because the man had fed a city through wars and snow and duplicity and wanted things no less real because he was fat. Manderley turned, took him in with a glance, and made a sound that might have been a cough or might have been a chuckle. "Hells," he said under his breath, fogging the air in front of him. "I told my cooks I was tired of surprises in pies. Now the yard is full of them." "The king is in your cellars," Theon said. "I know," Wyman Manderley replied and winked. "Do you think I knew nothing of what burrows under my feet? The North is always digging, Greyjoy, tunnels and grudges both." He patted Theon's arm with a hand the size of a ham. His breath smelled faintly of wine and onions. "My men are yours, for this purpose. They have been waiting to be called." He said it as casually as if they were discussing a hunt. Theon nodded, dizzy. Then the bell rang. It was a high, thin sound that bit the air. It ran along stone and caught at rafters. Men jerked like puppets pulled on strings. Theon felt it in the back of his teeth. He saw one of Stannis's men flinch and then freeze and force himself not to move. The yard shuddered with motion as men tumbled from doors, hands on belts, boots skidding. For one breath, Theon thought it had all been for nothing, that they would be seen and shouted and undone. Then he saw that the bell had rung from elsewhere, from the new-built tower where Roose kept his tally board and where he watched like a spider. And they were not the only spiders. Manderley moved with a speed that belonged to a thinner man. He lifted his walking stick and cracked a man in fry blue across the ear so hard the man collapsed like cloth. His men were already in motion. Theon saw 3 Winterfell small folk, men he had thought coward humps bent under burdens, drop their bundles and draw blades from them. He saw a kitchen girl pull a skewer from her apron and put it into a guard's eye as if skewering a pigeon. He saw one of Crowfoot's men. Crowfoot himself had not come up, drop from a balcony like a falling sack and land on a fry who had pretended to vomit while hiding a dagger. Stannis appeared at Theon's shoulder and did not announce himself. He struck a man at the base of the skull with a backhand that made the man drop his knife, and then with his other hand took the knife and sent it into another chest. It was all very clean, very fast, very cold. Roose Bolton came into the yard like a slow spill of tar. He walked as if the snow did not exist. He wore gray and pink, colors that only a certain kind of man could wear and look like himself. His eyes were small and pale, his mouth thin, and there was the faintest hint of a smile that never warmed anything. He looked at Stannis and did not look surprised. He looked at Theon and did not look surprised. He looked at the men on the ground, clutching, and his head tilted a fraction. He put his palm on the pommel of his sword and did not grip it. He had a way of standing very still that made every motion around him embarrassed in its haste. "Your Grace," he said to Stannis, as if speaking of a cathedral that had gone shabby. "You honor my house." "You dishonored it," Stannis said. The blade in his hand dripped once and then stilled. "I remedy." "Do you?" Roose asked. "I am to understand that your remedy includes the drowning of my son." "He was a crime walking," Stannis said. Roose's mouth moved in the smallest of ways. "He was effective. So are plagues," Stannis said. Men had stilled around them. The snow fell as if each flake had decided to consider carefully before landing where it did. Somewhere a dog barked once and then thought better than to again. Wyman Manderly set his feet and lifted his chin. "The girl in your hall is not Arya Stark," he said. He did not bother to couch it as accusation. It was a stone dropped into a pool to see what fish rose. "You did a cruel thing and called it lordship." Roose blinked very slowly, as if some mote had offended him and he was granting it a moment of attention. "I corrected a problem of legitimacy," he said. "I confess I did not expect any to be concerned with the girl's comfort." "Her comfort is not at issue," said another voice, cold and flat and with a precision that cut. Lady Dustin had appeared at the edge of things like a shadow folding itself into light. "My concern is lies on old bones. You took a name that wasn't yours and tried to make it so with hot wax and a ring." Her eyes slid to Theon and away. "The Crypts do not like that. The Crypts," Roose said, "are dead." He lifted his hand a hair's breadth from his sword hilt and let it fall again. "As will be most of you if you think to tell me what house shall sit where the snow will bury you without aid by nightfall." He turned his head to Stannis. "I think you mistake this for a game of tourney, your grace. 20 men in a courtyard does not make a war. Nor a flayed smile make a crown," Stannis said. "It could have gone a dozen ways then, all of them blood. But it went the way Winter wanted. Other men, Manderly men with eels worked into their cuffs, Stannis men with clenched jaws, even a few Flint men and tall lank Karstarks with arms bare to the cold as if daring it to find them thin, had fanned, quiet and quick, into good places. On the parapets at east and south, 2 of Wyman's men pulled levers. They had been given the job hours ago and had hidden there with skins to piss in and a bag of oatcakes. The heavy doors to the outer yard fell shut with a sound like doom making up its mind. The men in Fry Blue bunched without orders, looking around with the limp faces of fish out of water. The servants who had not expected to be part of anything now stood with cleavers and skewers and a courage that came in like a tide when a thing's time had turned. There would be fighting, there would always be fighting, but the tide was headed one way. Roose did not let the sorrow of that show. He gave Stannis the smallest of nods as if something had been agreed. "If we must," he said, "we can trade hostages like civilized men." His eye moved to Jane Poole where she stood hunched in a cloak too large for her, shivering near the kitchen door, and if that glance had touched her it would have burned. "The girl for my men's safe passage." "The girl is under my protection," Stannis said. "You do not get to take other men's names and then ask for the courtesy do your own." "Then you will kill me," Roose said flatly. "I suppose you might. And what then? A true-born heir? Where? The gods keep a poor ledger on my house. The fat man there speaks of legitimacy. Who is it that bears the name Stark and can sit this hall if you carry your point? Your red priests promised you a vision, perhaps. They promised us nothing but cold." "Rickon," Wyman Manderly said, with a smile that made his cheeks rise like loaves. "Rickon Stark lives, Lord Bolton. Did I not tell you? I have sent a man to bring him home. The boy is wild, but the North has loved wilder." His voice warmed. "You did not look for him because you were looking in your own counting house. Men who count forget that wolves count, too." Roose's face did not change, but Theon saw something pass across his eyes like a cloud. Deeper than that, perhaps, something that wondered what all those years of cold calculation had been worth if a child's name could unbalance the scales. He straightened the slightest bit and his gaze slid once more to Stannis. "If this is so," he said, "there will be war no matter what you do with me. There already is," Stannis said, and in that moment his voice had something like weary in it. Only today you do not get to call it peace. He took one step forward and for the first time drew the full bare length of steel. It looked blue in that light, and he held it like a promise he had no particular desire to keep but would keep because he said he would. Yield, he said. Roose Bolton did not know the word. Theon had never seen him say it. He had seen him offer gifts as if slicing off parts of himself. He had seen him offer nothing. Now he offered the thing he had left. A clean, quick making of more ghosts. His sword rasped from its sheath with a sound without drama. He moved forward 2 steps. Men moved with him because such men do. The yard exploded. It was brutal and it was quick because cold does not forgive hesitation. Theon put his knife into a boy he had watched once as the boy had sat on a barrel and listened to the spearwives singing, the pretty Southron songs that had hidden axes in their words. He watched the boy's mouth make an O like surprise and then stop. He saw Stannis trade 3 blows with a man in fry colors and leave the 4th for the man to wish he had not asked for. He saw Wyman Manderly's men press like bakers pushing dough and fold their enemies under them. He saw Lady Dustin's crossbowmen put 2 bolts into a man who could have been saved and then walk calmly to fetch their bolts out of bodies when there was a breath. He saw a maester, Donnell Winterfell's maester, with his round belly and rings with their dull sheen, grease the handle of a door with fat so a man's bloodied hand trembled and slid. When he looked again for Roose Bolton, he saw a man in gray with a film of red across his front. He saw the man stand in a great ring of snow in silence, and he saw Stannis come, not hurrying, to meet him. They looked like a painting carved in ice. "You are colder than this place," Roose said. "You were always a Southron's dream of a Northman." "And you," Stannis said, "were always a lie a child told himself in the dark so that he need not go to sleep." There were 4 strokes. After the first, blood made a line. After the second, men shouted. After the third, someone slipped on blood and fell and laughed with a hysteria that broke like thin glass. After the 4th, Roose Bolton went to his knees and then put his face in the snow, and the snow covered it because that is what it does. Silence came down with the flakes. It is hard to tell, sometimes, the difference between falling and listening. The gods would took them up because there was a thing that had to be done there. Jane Poole walked at Wyman Manderly's side and did not look to either side. Theon walked alone until someone touched his arm. He looked and saw Lady Dustin. She looked at him as if weighing a coin someone had bitten. Then she let him go and said nothing at all. It might have been kindness. He did not know what those looked like anymore. The heart tree waited with its mouth open and its eyes bleeding into the pool. Steam rose off the water and caught in the heart's lips like speech. Men stood in a circle that felt older than their bones. Stannis stood across from Wyman Manderly and they looked like winter and the coming of winter and the holding back of it between them. A priest of the red god Stannis had brought moved as if to approach and then saw the faces and thought better. This was not a place for his fire. "Say it," Manderly said to Jane gently, as if coaxing a truth from a child. "Tell them what you are. There is no dishonor in the being, only in what was done to make it." She swallowed and nodded. "I am Jane of Winterfell's kitchens," she said in a voice that at first was small and then grew. "My father was Vayan Poole, a man who kept the ledgers. I was taken and made to be someone else. I was hurt. I lived. I am not Arya Stark." She lifted her chin. "But I know Arya Stark's face will never sit well upon a Bolton's bones." There was a murmur, like wind in pine. Someone snorted. Someone else made a sound like a prayer. The heart tree said nothing. It had seen as much and more. Stannis's face did not move, but his eyes shifted to Theon. Theon stepped forward because his body moved before his mind did. He knelt in snow that was slush on top and ice beneath. He put his palms down and the ice tried to glue them there. "I am Theon of House Greyjoy," he said, the words tasting of iron and humiliation and some other thing he could not name. "Once Lord of Winterfell, falsely. Once the boy who lived here and ate your bread. I broke trust. I betrayed to men who did not love this place. I took what was not mine and broke it, and then I lied to mend it, and I am out of lies." He forced himself to look at the heart's face. I killed the miller's boys. I burned them and made them look like wolves to save my skin. And the gods saw me, and I know the price is not yet paid." He bowed his head and waited for the hot shame to rise and for knives to follow. "I know of a punishment," Stannis said. "I know of 30. I could read them to you and pick one. I could pick many and put them in a sack with you." He paused. "But we have work." He looked to Wyman Manderly. "If what you say is true, if this boy Rickon returns, I would hear from your lips in front of these trees what oath you mean to keep." Wyman Manderly's mouth twitched. He stepped forward and faced the heart tree like a supplicant and like a lord. "I, Wyman of House Manderly, Lord of White Harbor, swear to hold my byword on my honor and my belly both," he said, and a chuckle went through the circle because it was true. "If Rickon Stark returns, I will raise him to his father's seat, and I will not put a Fry or a Bolton in it." He glanced at Stannis, and now his smile turned wry. "As for kings, this North has always known how to bend a knee without breaking it. If your grace sits the Iron Throne, I will feed your ships and mend their sails. If you do not, I will still do what the North wants." "The North wants a Stark," said a thin woman's voice from the edge of the trees. Men turned. Lady Sibel Locke stood, chin up, like a winter bird, and there were a dozen like her beyond. Women whose husbands had been eaten by snow or by Southron politics. They nodded one after another. "We are tired of lordlings who can flay a man and call it justice." Stannis's mouth twisted. "Justice is meat cut clean, not flayed," he said. "I will give it or hang by it. This I swear." He looked at Theon again. "And you, Theon Greyjoy, reek." The word was not an insult in his mouth, only an inventory. "Your punishment is this: you do what work I set you, and then you go to the wall and take black if they will have you. If they will not, you hang. If you flee, I find you." He held Theon's eyes and Theon could not look away. "You seem to want a sentence. There is one." Theon bowed his head to the snow. It felt like relief and horror together. "Yes," he said. "Yes, your grace. They did not feast that night. They ate hot meat and stale bread and drank wine that had not been kept for this hour, and they ate quickly at tables they had moved into the hall with bodies still cooling along the walls. The ashes in the fireplace were thick and old, and the new flames crackled as if excited to have proper company. Men spoke in low voices and women pitched their speech even lower. Theon sat at the lower end with men of White Harbor and a few Risswell men who wore their loyalty like a second shirt they were not yet sure of. He ate without tasting. Across the hall, he saw Jane wrapped in a blanket, cheeks pink with heat, eyes enormous. Wyman Manderly sat and ate and sent orders to men who came and went like crows. Lady Dustin stood beneath a pillar with one hand on a wolfhound's head. Stannis drank hot wine as if it were a punishment he set himself. The body of Roose Bolton lay with a cloth over it near the stairs for an hour and then was taken out. The men who took it looked more careful than needed. Theon watched them go and found he felt nothing. It wasn't until later, when the quiet had settled, that he realized he had expected to feel something like dancing in his bones. He had learned there is no dance that follows a thing like that. Only work. They worked. They sent riders into the snow with letters sealed with wax that would crack in the cold and with the tokens that mattered more. The idea fixed to a man's hand that a Stark might sit Winterfell again. They sent men west to the Rills and south toward Barrowton with promises in their mouths that might yet be false but felt true when spoken beneath the heart tree. They hanged men in the yard who had worn pink by choice and not fear. They did it without cruelty, and that mattered. They opened the granaries with a tally and a count, and the cook with the scar across her lip organized a line that did not break and fed small folk enough to keep hands warm one more day. They let the fires in the baths burn long enough for wounded to wash and not die of fever. They did a dozen things that do not make stories but do make a hall livable. Word came within 2 days from White Harbor that a galley had been sighted at the Wolf's Den, and that men were saying Davos Seaworth's name with something like relief. Wyman Manderly chuckled low and skedded himself and sat down harder than usual when he received the tidings, as if an invisible load had slid off his shoulder. "Good," he said, so softly it was almost not words. "Good, good." He sent men with fish on their banners to bring the smuggler to Winterfell if the heavy snow would permit, and he paced the hall until manderly women told him to sit and blow. Another messenger, thin as a reed and twice as bent, brought a strip of parchment with a crude wolf's head scratched on it in charcoal along with 3 words. "The boy lives." The message had come from a place no one wanted to write the name of, and it made men's eyes go up and to the side where they hid their superstitions, and it made Wyman Manderly's hands shake where before nothing had. "Good," he said again. "Good. The north is not empty of wolves." Stannis heard the news and nodded once, which was as much joy as Theon had ever seen in him. He had men to beat into order and orders to make from nothing and a winter to plan, and he did those with the same grim attention he gave to trimming his beard. He stood in Winterfell's hall and occupied it uneasily, as if he understood that the place belonged to someone else and he was there to warm it until its owner put a key in the door. It was odd to watch a Southron king observe a northern house's politeness, but he made himself do it. Theon almost respected him for that. The pink letter never came to the wall. Jon Snow stood on the wind-scoured step of the Lord Commander's tower and looked south with the face of a man who had decided to do a thing and was waiting for some small sign from the gods saying no. The sign did not come. The messenger did, panting and white-lipped, with a different sealed scrap bearing Wyman Manderly's sigil, and Jon took it in his hands without awe because awe didn't help much at the top of the world. He read what Wyman wrote. A Stark boy alive, Winterfell in snow but not in pink, and something inside him, tight as a fist since the day he had read words that had never been penned, loosened and went away like breath when pain departs. He went to find the Red Woman then because he had to. She stood by a brazier with flames licking up a little like tongues. "You saw him dead," he said, more accusation in the words than he intended. "I saw fire," she said, "and a man with a cruel smile who drowned in black water." She tilted her head. "Light calls to light. The rest is men's remembering." Jon did not trust her. He barely trusted himself. He trusted the old boards of the wall and the brothers who had held their duty's weight until they stooped. And he trusted the girls and boys that the world had tried to make into something else and who might yet stand up and say no. He turned and looked north and thought of wildlings gathered under new roofs and of Hardhome, which still hung on his mind like a stone. "We have work," he said, to himself as much as to her, and he turned the wall's attention where it had needed to be all along. Sansa in the Vale got news months later, wrapped in a letter of polite falsehood from a man who called himself her guardian with a great many words for her and very few for anyone else. He wrote that the Boltons had found the winter too tough for their taste and had been put out like old fires by a man with a jaw carved by carpenters. He wrote that a lord in White Harbor was promising wolves again. He did not write the word Stark. He did not need to. Sansa took the letter to the head of the east where the wind blew swords and let it cut her hair free from the ribbons she had braided it with and then bound it up again on her own without wanting anyone to help her. She stood a long time with frost settling on her lashes and felt the mountain look down at her and judged it kinder than men. She said nothing to anyone. Later, she took a stitch of blue silk and put it into a hem where only women would see it and men would miss it. It was a coded thing and a comfort. In some other life, she would have been content to do such things forever. In this one, she put away contentment. Asha Greyjoy, Asha, not the book name the Southrons used in their cracked thinking, sat on a stool near the hall's fire with chains on her ankles and a cup in her hands and watched Theon with the eyes of a woman who had seen him all ways and knew which to choose and which to mock. "So you killed him," she said without ceremony when news had reached even the men in irons that Ramsay's smile would not offend anyone again. "I watched him die," Theon said. "It was enough." "You always liked watching," she said, and when he flinched she shook her head. "No, not like that. We all do when that is what is left us. You gonna do a foolish thing now, little brother? Or a useful one?" "Both," he said, because it felt true. "Stannis will send me to the wall." "Good," Asha said promptly, as if it had been a thing she had hoped for, and not because she wanted him far away, but because she was disposed these days to want him wherever he could do least harm. "Maybe there you'll find a god that suits you, a god with more ice than salt." He looked at her. "And you?" She lifted her chain with 2 fingers. "I'll be exchanged for food and men if Stannis is sensible," she said. Or he'll kill me to appease some Northman's sense of neatness. He won't, Theon said, surprising himself. He wants victories he can count. He won't waste you on an arithmetic that exact. He'll barter. She laughed low and sharp. Aye, and if he barters well, I'll be back at sea within a year, storm and God's willing, and you'll be a crow with a head too full of ghosts. He reached out and touched her wrist. She did not pull away. I'm sorry, he said. He meant it in 100 ways, and none of them would mend the things they were meant to mend. I know, she said, and sounded tired more than anything else. So am I. But sorry is not a rope, Theon. It does not haul a ship off a shoal. Work does, he said. That's right, Asha replied, as if speaking to a boy again. Keep your head down and your knife clean and your oaths taken. Maybe you'll fit your bones better before you turn to bone. Maybe I will too. Davos Seaworth came in with salt on him and steam on his breath. And for the first time since Theon had returned to Winterfell, he felt that the sea had walked into a room and not spoiled it. Davos smelled like ropes and iron and persistent hope. He bowed awkwardly before the heart tree because he had learned manners in a hard school and kept them even in the face of gods that did not take him. Wyman Manderly clapped his shoulders and laughed like bread breaking. You old turnip, he said gruffly, thick with fondness. You did it? Tell me I did not send you into darkness to fetch me mist. I did it, Davos said simply, and some men blinked because they had not thought simplicity a coin men still used. He lives. He's a small wild thing. He got large eating. There were wolves. He scratched his beard and looked at Stannis and at the tree and then at Wyman again and smiled a little with the left side of his mouth. There were worse things than wolves. The island did not want to be visited, but I brought him off and Osha with him, and we gave the island back to its bitterness. Skagos is bitter enough to sweeten the rest of the world, Wyman Manderly said with satisfaction. He breathed in as if smelling a roast. Where is the boy? Coming, Davos said. 5 days back, and he will be longer now in this weather. But he breathes and he bites and he is a Stark. You'll know him when he tells you you're a fool. They come by that natural. Stannis did not smile, but his mouth softened in what, on another man, would have been a grin. Good, he said. My work becomes easier with a boy to rally the ice to. He glanced at Theon. And yours harder. Theon nodded. He did not ask for mercy because mercy was a thing you earned when no longer asking. He helped arrange a place for the boy, a bed near the hall's hearth but with a screen so he could hear men and not be too cold. He went with Davos to the Godswood and listened to the story of the island that had wanted to keep the Stark and the wild woman who had wanted to keep him more. He looked up into the heart tree's face and wondered if its eyes had ever wept for those lost in the snow. He wondered if it had looked at him years ago and known he would come to this, a man not yet a man trying to make repairs with hands that shook. The boy came as Davos had promised, riding on a shaggy little horse with a wolf half his equal on either side. He was taller than when Theon had last seen him, which was not saying much but was a thing that jabbed him in the ribs nonetheless. He had hair like stormy night and eyes like a quiet river when it goes deep. He slid off the pony without grace and looked around the yard like a lord who had never yet learned his courtesy but would when he had to. He saw the heart tree and went to it without greeting any man. Rickon, Wyman Manderly said. So softly the name was a prayer. Rickon put both his hands on the heart's face and his head against it and stood a long time. Osha, hair full of wind, stood a little away, watching with hard eyes. One of the wolves, Shaggy Dog, Theon thought with a gulp he could not help, lifted its lip at a boy who had edged too close and showed teeth longer than a man's thumb. The boy retreated. The dog lowered its lip and sneezed. When Rickon turned, he had leaves stuck to his hair and his face was wet. He looked at them all and they looked back at him and no one said anything. He found Wyman Manderly's eyes and then Stannis's and then Theon's. He took a step toward Theon and Theon swallowed because he had not thought he would do that. The boy's face was floral with anger and grief and all the things boys stare at and do not know how to name yet. He stood in front of Theon and stared up and Theon could not have looked away if he had been offered a kingdom. You burned the wrong boys, Rickon said. He said it like naming a thing you have stepped in and cannot decide whether to scrape off or just throw your boots away. Yes, Theon said. I did. Rickon's mouth twisted. His hand twitched. The wolf at his hip put its nose forward and took Theon's smell into itself and then snorted and looked away as if bored. Rickon lifted his chin. Are you sorry? He asked. Yes, Theon said. Always. Rickon nodded. Once, sharply, and spat in the snow. Good, he said, and turned away and went to Wyman Manderley and let the big man's hands envelop his shoulders like bread. It was not absolution. It was a notice of debt, recorded in a child's scratch. Stannis announced the thing that had to be announced then, in the hall with the heart watching them through snow on the windows. He stood and held his hands like a man who wanted to grip something and would not because he was not in his own hall and did not have the right. Winterfell belongs to the Starks, he said, and men's chests loosened all over the hall for hearing that said aloud by a king. I am no thief. I will fashion the realm in my image, but I will not break the old in order to fit the new. Rickon Stark will sit as Lord of Winterfell under me as king, when I am king, and under my justice even if I am not. He paused, eyes narrowed. For this, I require oaths. Men came forward in their time. Wyman Manderley with his hands like loaves and his voice like a song sung under one's breath. Lord Locke with his thin face. Meege Mormont's daughter with her chin and her bear's heart. Karstarks who had found their way back to honor by a crooked path that left blood still sticking to their boots. Ryswells who deferred to Lady Dustin's expression and obeyed it. A dozen small men who had once bowed to the Dreadfort because the Dreadfort was nearer and Winterfell had been silent. One by one they made their words in the hearing of old gods and a southern king too cold to lie. Stannis took each oath as if it were a hammer stroke on an anvil. He meant to shatter into something like a blade. Barrowton sent word of fealty with a soft glove enclosing a steel hand. Lady Barbary Dustin would not walk into a hall that had once turned her away and pretend it was hers, not yet. Skagos sent no word but the wolf's head smudged again on a strip of hide that smelled of salt and something older. The Rills sent meat because meat in winter is a pledge deeper than ink. Even Deepwood Mott sent a basket of pine cones with a note tied to the handle. For the fires we borrowed, we will repay more when we have it. And Theon recognized Asha's hand and smiled despite himself. Beyond the hall and the oaths, beyond the wolves that begged and the children that played and the old women who clucked their tongues and made everything in the same pot taste somehow different, the world remained turned on its teeth. The Freys retreated from the north with their bridles bitten and their pride flensed by cold. Raven from the south brought word that the lion in King's Landing had begun to cough up his gold on men he did not trust, and another that a queen had walked naked through a city that hated her. Men snorted and said nothing. More ravens brought talk of a red queen with dragons walking back into grass and flame and the problems that attend all queens with dragons. Stannis listened and nodded, and if he judged, he kept it inside the scar tissue he had built around his heart. Theon climbed the stairs to the roof sometimes at night and let the snow lie on his face. He dreamed of warm stones and cold hands, of blood freezing into a map on a lake and breaking apart in spring. He dreamed of two boys with their faces hidden and woke with their names on his tongue. Sometimes he climbed down to the crypts and stood a long time with his hands behind his back like a schoolboy caught and confessed. The Stone Kings looked at him with their swords across their laps. Their faces were calm and dead, and he found a kind of comfort in that. Their expectations could no longer be betrayed. He would go to the wall with a small escort when the snow let them and take his oath before the heart tree there, and give his name to a brotherhood he had set to fire once. He would lay his shame on the stones and see if they sank or floated. He would watch men die quietly in the snow and know he could do nothing else for them but keep the fire fed with his breath. He would keep watch for things with ice in their veins that did not fear the dark because they were the dark. He would do work and wait for forgiveness that might never come and would not be less for the waiting. He wanted to tell the heart these things and did not know how, so he told the wind instead, and the wind took them away or brought them back. He did not mind. When he left Winterfell, it was like being cut out. Wyman Manderley pressed a warm loaf into his hands with a sigh, as if sending a child out into a storm with a sweater. Asha, unchained and in mail again, clapped him on the shoulder and told him not to be a fool where it would matter. Stannis said nothing to him at all, which felt fair. Jane Poole kissed his cheek in a motion so quick, he might have thought it a flake of snow if not for the warmth and the wetness that followed. Lady Dustin watched from a window with the wolfhound's muzzle pressed to her knee and did not lift her hand. Rickon stood in the yard with the wolf at his side and said nothing and, after a time, lifted his chin, which was enough. They rode north, 5 men and a boy on a shaggy horse that kept turning its head as if to count them. The world narrowed to white and the dark spine of the wall growing. The watchmen there looked down at him with their faces like scars and let him pass because the letter in his wallet with Stannis' seal pressed red into it said he should, and because Jon Snow looked at him and saw a thing he recognized. A man who had learned too late what he ought to have known and was trying to back into it. "You know your work?" Jon asked, his voice tired as the gray sky. "I learn fast," Theon said, and tried to smile past the heel of his fear. "Slower than I should have, but fast." Jon nodded. "It will do," he said. And then the horn on the wall blew and men moved like the cogs of a great cold clock. There was an attack to answer, or a rescue to attempt, or a wall to mend with frozen mud. And Theon went to take his turn because it was what came next, and he had learned that what comes next is sometimes all that matters. In Winterfell, the fires burned day and night because the walls drank heat greedily and no amount could satisfy them. Rickon ran the halls with his wolf as if he were trying to trace the shape of his home from the inside like a boy learning his mother's face by touch. Wyman Manderley wrote letters with ink that froze in the well and thawed by the hearth and froze again, and when his fingers ached he had girls with warm hands knead the ache out like dough. Lady Dustin rode in the snow with 3 men at her back and a bitterness on her tongue that tasted sweet sometimes when she bit it. Stannis bounced his leg with impatience and taught those around him how to do the dull work that keeps men alive between glories. Davos sat by the fire with Osha and listened to her tell the boy the stories he needed, not the ones that would make him polite. The woods beyond Winterfell filled with men who had come to look upon a place they had been told was lost. They came and went with the care of animals and brought meat when they could and took news when they could not. They spoke of a season still to come when nothing with breath would be safe. And they spoke of it not with dread but with the manner of men who have known the place beyond dread and had come back with empty hands and work to do. Crows lifted from the graves as snow shifted and the sun touched their wings a moment and made their blackness gleam like oil. Then the light was gone and they were just crows again. Winterfell remained, as it had for 1,000 years, a thing built to be burned and to stand in its ash all at once. The steam rose from its pools, thin and ghostly. The heart tree bled its slow red and watched without taking sides. The long hall filled and emptied and filled. Men fought and lay down and rose to fight again. Women tended and told truths to those who did not want them. The pink vanished from banners and from the thoughts of men who least knew they had taken it up. In the spring, not the spring of the world, which might be a long time coming, but a spring like a deep breath taken in winter. A raven came from Old Town with news no one needed and some men liked to hear, about a porridge of debate deciding whether Stannis would be invited to kneel before a boy in the south with a hair that had too much gold to let him taste the iron under his tongue. Stannis threw the message into the fire without reading it all the way through. Wyman Manderley laughed until he had to have a stool under him. Davos shrugged. Lady Dustin looked as if she could have told a story about why that was a bad idea, then did not bother. Rickon chased a wolf down a hall with a sword that's still mostly a piece of wood and shouted. The sound echoed like a memory turned new again. Under the wall, Theon learned how to stand in calm in the face of things that had no faces. He learned to hold the fire so men could sleep even when sleep was a rumor. He learned to read a sky for more than weather and to trace in his mind how wind laid itself down when it had been beaten by stone. He watched men die well and badly and pulled only one of them back by the collar because that was the one he happened to be nearest and his hands had been empty then. He did the work and said little. Some nights, when he sat with his back pressed to cold wood and the fire painting his knees with heat, he took out the pieces of names he had left and arranged them on the inside of his skull and tried to make them spell forgiveness. He did not succeed. He did not stop trying. Letters came and men with news came with them and sometimes without. The north knit itself again. not into a cloth without holes or patches, but into something a man could wrap around his shoulders and stand in. Men in gray had come to Winterfell and made rules and called it governance, and then were gone like wine spilled on snow and soaked through. Men with old grudges and older griefs had come and spoken them aloud, and then had allowed their sons to stand with sons of those they had resented because time was short and the snow did not take testimonials at the door. None of it was perfect, and none of it needed to be. It needed only to be done. One night, when the wind fell to a whisper and the flames in the brazier of the Lord Commander's tower held blue tongues at their tips that made the air feel colder near the heat than far from it, a bundle of skins came up the steps with hunger in its eyes and a sword too large for it strapped to its back. The bundle unwrapped itself and a girl stared out. Hair in braids, eyes like a winter sea, stubbornness like a cloak. She looked at Jon Snow without fear. She looked at Theon without forgiveness. She had walked a long way to not be who men had told her she was. She had a wolf with her, one gray and wise as an old stone. She did not say its name, and neither did Theon. Some things you do not speak, because to name them is to set them loose or to break them. She stood and thought and ate, and she told Jon a thing he had needed to hear, and he told her a thing she had wanted not to. And then they sat with their backs to the same wall and breathed together, and the world moved forward despite itself. In Winterfell, Rickon learned when not to splinter the practice swords on his cousin's knees, and when to take someone's hand when he wanted to bite it. He learned to listen to the men around him whose faces wore the maps of their lives and who would follow him not because he was their favorite boy or because he was cleverer than they were, but because he bore a name the Snows still recognized. He learned to sit on a chair that had once held his father while men argued and not to interrupt. He learned to go to the godswood and put his head on the bark and hear nothing and feel comfort in that. He learned sometimes to weep and, more rarely, not to. He learned to say, "I am sorry," less than Theon did. But when he did, he learned to mean it and not to ask for less because the saying hurt. Stannis kept Winterfell as a place he would visit and rule from and leave, because his war would not allow him to sit any one fire too long. He marched men south and lost some and gritted his teeth and marched again. He sent letters north and received them in return, and sometimes he tossed them into whichever fire was nearest, and sometimes he kept them and reread them when he was too tired to sleep but too stubborn to close his eyes. He had a vision in his head of a realm that worked like a proper wheel, all cogs and no soft metal to bend, and the realm did not care for that much. He put his shoulder to it anyway. There is a kind of heroism in that songs forget. Time, which does not love kings or wolves more than it loves stones and water, passed. Men who had sworn oaths put their hands in the dirt and planted, because the snows were thinner one year than the last. A summer grew in mines, if not yet in the ground. A ship with a broken mast limped into the harbor at White Harbor, and men on it told stories of dragons seen very far away, as if those were seas they had crossed rather than words they had heard and liked the sound of. Wyman Manderley died one spring with a smile on his lips and a loaf of brown bread in his hands and 3 women banging pots in the kitchen for luck. The boy Rickon, who was less a boy each day, stood before the heart tree with the red-leaved blood hiding in the snow and pressed his forehead to it and told it that he would do his best. And the heart tree did not laugh. Theon Greyjoy took his watch and kept it. He mended props on the wooden walkways and counted arrows and made sure the bread came out of the ovens with the brown just so. He fought when the wall called for that and cut wood when it needed that more. He did not ask to be told he was forgiven. The gods had their own business. He kept men alive with labor he had once believed beneath him. Sometimes he went to the top of the wall and put his hand on the ice and remembered the feel of the warm drip in the tunnels of Winterfell, the 2 ends of the world touching and him between. Sometimes he dreamed of a lake cracking under a man's boots and woke with his fists clenched and his teeth aching. The sound of the ice breaking never left him. He was glad of it. If Ramsay Bolton had lived, perhaps all of this still would have been, only noisier and uglier and more wasteful of those little graces, by which men stand up to winter. But he had drowned because he had believed the ice would hold him and that he could make it do so by wanting it. The world does not care for such men as that, not forever. The North had been held by fear and the promise of flayed things and the laughter of a bastard who no longer mattered. It was held now by something not yet like courage but like work, and a name returned to a chair in a hall that smelled of steam and roasted meat and men's breath. The heart tree stood and watched and bled its old slow blood and saw children with wolves at their heels run again and did not move. It did not approve because trees do not, but its roots felt the fire, and that was enough. On a morning when the sun had the peculiar brightness of winter turning toward spring, Theon walked along the outer palisade of Castle Black and saw the snow thinning in places like a woman's hair. In the courtyard below, a girl with gray eyes sparred with a boy and laughed when he fell. Jon stood with his hands behind his back and did not smile, and Theon understood he was smiling anyway. A raven on the edge of the rookery fluffed its feathers and looked at him and croaked something that sounded like names. He lifted a hand to it and the bird hopped away, offended because that was what birds did. He looked north, where the forest was a line drawn with charcoal on the horizon. The night lived up there. It would come down again and bring its cold with it and its teeth, and he would stand and do what work he had, and if he died he would die stripped of the wrong name and wearing no new one, only a man's. He found he was not afraid of that. In Winterfell, a boy with a wolf at his side heard men argue and decided some things had been said in this hall often enough, and he stood and spoke, and the men fell quiet and listened. He spoke not with the words of kings or lords, but with the phrases he had learned at the knees of cooks and men who cleaned the drains and hunters who knew which branches would break in a storm and which would not. He spoke with the knowledge that cold is cold and bread is bread, and men do not light fires with promises. The hall listened. The gods would listen. The snow, which had its own stories, fell and melted and fell again, because that is what it does until it does not. The wolves ran. The North remembered, as it always says it will, and this time it did so with mercy in the remembering. The work went on. The dead stayed where they were put for now. The world held together under the weight of men's insistence that it must. And the sound of a lake cracking under a bad man's boots was a story told sometimes in the kitchens with hedgehog pies and laughter that caught, and sometimes in the yard when boys were told not to trust ice, and sometimes in the gods' wood where no one needed it told. The sound lingered. It made a kind of music. Men took its rhythm into their work and stepped to it, and it was perhaps enough. The wind that slipped along the wall that night carried no voice, but Theon heard one anyway. It was a habit he had learned when voices in his head had kept him alive by telling him when to crawl and when to howl. He pulled his cloak closer and walked the top of the ice with a lantern hooded to a thumb's width so it would not blind him. Below, the world fell away into a depth that had swallowed whole armies in tails. Above, stars hung close as nails in a black plank. He stopped where the builders had gone to more trouble than usual to shore the walk. The ice there buckled in a way that made men slow and put a hand to the rope fixed to iron rings. He had ordered it tarred in the afternoon so it wouldn't cut, and the smell of pitch lingered. He traded the lantern to his left hand and laid his right palm to the ice. Even through glove and scar he felt a cold older than his wrongs. Behind him boots thudded, light and quick. Theon knew them by now. He did not turn until the steps stopped at his shoulder. "You look as if you try to drink the dark," the girl said. Her hair had come free from its plait in two places and whipped like a banner. The wolf at her heel paced, stopped, paced, stopped, as if the rampart were a forest path it judged inferior. "It's strong stuff," Theon said. "I've had worse." He shifted, letting her come up even with him. The wolf's yellow eyes took his scent like a question, then dismissed him with a small breath. He could have been glad of that. She put her palms on the parapet and peered north. No lights out there until the low glow that marked a watchfire at the end of the shadow of the world. The wild was a black sea with icebergs of snow. "He never let me come up here when I was small," she said, and Theon did not have to ask who she meant. "I'd creep and there would be a hand on my hood and I would be turned around like a kitten. It made me want it more." "Wanting is work," Theon said. She did not look at him. "Sometimes it is only wanting." She pushed air out through her teeth and fog blossomed and vanished. "They say there's a place in the east, beyond the mountains with the fat name, where folk teach boys to run on ropes hung between roofs. If you fall you break your neck and they still do it. They do it better for knowing that. I think about that sometimes when I cross the ice." Theon found himself smiling. "You'd have liked that," he said, "and broken nothing. You would have made the rest look like fishermen." "They teach girls too," she said, and he heard the flat edge to it and nodded. The wind scraped across the ice like a thin knife. "Alice Karstark is an hour out," she said softer, as if news needed to be wrapped to keep it from cracking. Men ran down from the guard on the milkwater. "She has riders behind her who want her for a broodmare and a signing hand." "Sigorn's ready?" Theon asked, and she nodded. "He looks scared," she said, and now she smiled a little, not unkindly. "He'll do. Men who aren't Scar. And don't look where their feet go. John says that. He says fear is a good teacher and a bad master. I suppose he's right. His mouth does that thing when he lies." She mimed a tight line. "You're coming to the yard?" he asked. "I'm going to the gate," she said, and that was answer enough. They went down the long stair together, Theon letting her set the pace because she would anyway. Men were moving with the quiet gear of a watch drilled to move without dram. Torches bled and gutters smoked. At the foot, Jon Snow stood with his hands behind him and his cloak pinned wrong, and Theon thought, as he often had, that the boy who had once envied that face would be ashamed by the man's envy now. Jon had the look of somebody replied to by the world. "Alice Karstark is near enough to smell our smoke," Jon said when they came close. He did not smile, but something eased in him when he saw the girl's wolf. "Open the small gate. No banners. No horns. When she is in, you close the teeth and leave them shut until I say." "Lord Commander," Marsh said from the side, his face gray in the torchlight. "Brother Marsh," Jon said, "you have bread for the Karstark men who come without swords?" "I have bread for men with swords who come without blood on them," Marsh said. "And I'll keep the knives on the table, my lord." "Good," Jon said, and there was no heat in it. He turned to Theon. "Take 6 to the gate walk. If men try to force, drop the bars and douse them with oil. Do not burn unless they burn first. I will not set fire to men for their lord's hunger." "What if they set arrows on fire?" the girl asked. "Then we put their fire out," Jon said. "And we do it without showing our teeth. That's the trick. Wolves know it." He glanced at the wolf, and the wolf's tail whisked once. "Go!" The gate's teeth were thick as a man's thigh. Men hung near them with gloved hands and hooks, ready to haul and lock. Beyond the little wicket, wind ran like a restless dog. Theon sent 2 to the murder holes with jars. The rest he placed along the walk with crossbows cranked back but hooded. "No shouting. No easy glory." He liked it. It meant the men would live. The riders came out of the snow with their heads down and their mounts blowing clouds. A woman rode at their head on a horse that looked as if it had decided not to die purely to spite the air in its lungs. She had a hood up, and from beneath it hair escaped that might have been brown if the light had bothered to help. At her shoulder rode a man with a face like a hatchet and a boy who kept glancing back and getting his mount to dance when it should not. Behind them the snow moved and reframed itself, and then became a line of men whose cloaks were not black. They did not gallop. A tired pursuit had a stagger to it you learned to see. "Gate," the woman called, voice raw. "Open." "Name," Theon said. He could have said, "Who goes?" But that was for plays and men who had never watched a man freeze in a door because words took too long. "Alice Karstark of Karhold," she said. "I claim guest right and your Lord Commander's word." "Come," Jon said from below, and the teeth lifted with a groan and a sigh. Alice rode in with her men and did not look back. The boy let his horse jink again. The hatchet-faced man swore, grabbed the boy's bridle and hauled him straight. Then the teeth dropped again and the pursuit thudded up against the barred wood, breath rising, men real enough to smell and not near enough to touch. Spears came up from below like a field sprouting. The men outside talked all at once and threw ropes that slid off ice and linen rinds and made men inside snort. Alice sat her horse and did not flinch. She had a thin scar at her mouth that pulled a little when she breathed. Theon thought she looked like a girl furious at being made a woman by men who wanted to own the result. Inside the gate, within the tunnel with its breath and old runnels of fat, the girl and the wolf waited. Alice saw them, slid off the horse badly because she was stiff, and went to both knees in the dirty snow with no care for her cloak. The wolf stepped up with the silent curiosity only big animals hold and put its nose mere inches from her face. Alice did not blink. She looked into Yellow and said, "You are what my house forgot." The wolf half closed its eyes and then sneezed a fine spray over her cheek. She laughed, short and honest, and Theon liked her immediately. Jon came forward and held out a hand, and Alice took it. "Guessed right," Jon said. "Bread and salt. Your pursuers can bellow their lungs to meat for all I care. You'll sleep under my roof and wake safe for one day more." "I'll take that," Alice said, her voice gone ragged tender now that a promise had been put in front of it. "I'll take it twice." The pursuit beat the door like drums in a far hall for a time and then stopped when the cold told them the truth. The knives came off the table. Bread was broken and salt was taken. The wolf lay at the girl's feet and sighed as if the business were dull. Theon watched Alice pull warmth back into her face the way a blacksmith pulls a bar to yellow. Then Jon sent most men to their sleep and kept a few to stand, and the stone took the heat and gave it back by increments until the hall held something like a hug. "We'll marry her to Sigorn on the morrow," Jon said to the girl and Theon at the shadow end of the hearth where men slumped. "It will anger Carhold and please nobody much, which is exactly what we need." "Angering a lord is a way to teach him to listen," the girl said. "I've never met one who learned any other way." Jon snorted, the closest he came to laughter when the day had laid its long hand on his shoulders. "You're not wrong," he said. "He sent you a letter," Theon said to Jon, "because it would do no good to wait. You're king." "He sent me a token with it," Jon said, and reached into his cloak and pulled out a small crust of white wax with a heavy impression the color of dried blood. The stag's head looked tired. "He wants men. I can hardly spare breath to fog the air, let alone men to walk into it." "He also sent one to Winterfell," the girl said, "to the boy and the men around him. He wants them further south to take his justice to men who can write their wrongs down and call them laws." Theon's jaw moved. "Will they go?" "They'll go as far as the Twins," she said. "After that the river takes over and men there think they own it. The ones who broke bread with the Red Wedding won't be safe in a hall with strangers much longer." The grin that flashed then had the shape of a knife. "I hope they learn to sleep by doors." Alice Karstark did not sleep much. At dawn she stood in the yard with a cloak on her shoulders too big for her bones and her hair braided close to her skull. She had a knife at her belt like a man who had only lately learned where her body ended and other men's hands began. Sigorn came from the huts with a look on his face as if someone had pushed him into a river. His thens formed a square without command and stood with their arms crossed. They did not like walls. They did not like roofs. They liked this well enough, to stand saying with shoulders what other men splashed with words. Jon married them with words older than his house and a slice of bread broken and a pinch of salt. And then he kissed Alice's brow and Sigorn's cheek, and the thens grunted something that might have been approval and might have been a promise to make their approval known later. Alice stood with her back very straight and did not put her head down for anyone. Theon, watching from the place you watch from when you have sworn to be not much, felt a looking on that had no envy in it at all. He wondered if that was what growing up looked like, watching somebody else get what they needed and wanting it for them more than for yourself. The day barely started and staggered, for winter was like an old man who had to rest after putting on his boots, when horns blew at Eastwatch and sent ravens rushing as if men had thrown stones at the rookeries. The bird that hit Jon's sleeve hit hard enough to sting. He loosened the leather, took the note, and read it all in one inhale. He exhaled and the air trailed white off his lips. "Boats?" he said to Theon and the girl. "Too many. There's smoke behind them like a bad thought. Hard home." The word fell and made men stand up from benches without meaning to. Theon felt the old cold in his gut that had learned to move in when a thing needed doing and would take longer than a day to do. Jon dragged the map out and laid it flat and set a knife on it as a weight and traced with his forefinger. The sea there had teeth drawn on it like a child's. The headland bent like a crooked finger. "We can't leave men there," he said. "Not after we told them to go and wait and keep faith and light fires where we told them to." The girl leaned over the wooden north and put her fingertip down opposite Jon's. "The last time you sent men, they didn't come home," she said, and there was no accusation in it. There was only sense. "Send fewer and you'll lose more." Send more and we can't hold the wall. Theon scraped a nail across the edge of the table, his mind making lists the way it had learned, slow and thorough. Take Mormont, he said. He's learned the swell of that water and it likes him. Take me. I won't break under the cold anymore. He swallowed. Take her, he added, and the girl gave him a glance that was almost surprised and almost amused. You can move where a man can't. You can smell a trap with your nose. And the wolf, she said, as if announcing an old companion. And the wolf, Jon agreed. And Melisandre. She makes fires. And for once I don't mind what you have to burn to get one quick. He took his own breath like a draft and it set him back up straight. We take 5 boats. We take 30 men to hold the beach. We bring them in and out like blood. Blood runs onto the ground and you lose it, the girl said, and Jon's mouth did the thing again. The knot smile that was as close as he came when he did not want to show his teeth to the day. We'll try to avoid the ground, he said. Rouse them.
Fill your skins.
Melt the sharp edges off everything that will need to go into a hand. If you get cold, say so. If you can't hold a rope, say so. If you need to piss, say so and piss. Don't try to piss with your cock stuck to your hand. He stared around and men who had laughed before swallowed theirs. We do not leave men behind if leaving them behind makes new enemies. We do not pick up dead men and carry them home to see them stand up and shake off our kindness. If what is dead stays dead, we burn it anyway. If it tries to stand, we make it a story for someone else to tell because we will be busy rowing. He stepped back from the table. Do your work. Don't do more. Theon had not slept when the boats bumped off and slid and banged against the ice and then took the swell. He had lashed the boat's bow rope to his wrist with a knot an old Raiders boatman had taught him, the knot that lets you cut a friend free if a wave wants to take him to the goddess. He did not call to any goddess. A frozen fringe over the sea broke off in plates like scuts and bobbed. Their boat slid between and over, stern taking a thump that men grunted at. The air had so much salt in it, it tasted of old tears. Hardhome smoked like a fire scene on a winter night from a long way. Smoke is a comfort when it means a hearth. When it means men burning wood to keep the cold back, it is a comfort. When it means a god burning men because men asked, it is not. The fire that marked Hardhome was many small fires that made one large smear against the sky. There was no smell yet. The wind had not decided which way to carry the day. Mormont stood in the boat with his bow planted against his thigh and watched as if he could hurl the distance away by looking. Melisandre stood in the stern of Jon's boat with her hair unbound for once and a cloak pinned at the throat and her eyes half closed. Theon rowed because he had the back for it, and the scars there were only decoration. The girl sat low near the bow of another boat with her hand on the wolf's neck while it watched the water with calm offense. They grounded in the little cove below the cliff where the rock made a theater open to the sea. Theon jumped into water that seized his legs like a vice and hauled the boat in over the last hump and then turned to help pull the others. In the pocket of the beach between 2 black shoulders of stone, the boats made a direction. Jon made the other with his voice and his arms. Men ran up under the cliff with shields held over them and set themselves like stakes. Theon took his axe and kissed his knuckles to wake them and ran down the gravel with 2 others to where the driftwood lay piled, to build a second line of fire behind the first. They did not have to wait long. The first of the wildlings came down the goat path in ones and twos like men who had been told a rope would be thrown to them and were trying to see where to catch it. They had the half-drunk look of those who have warmed themselves from the inside when they should have done it from the out. Their children made small shapes under huge cloaks. Theon saw a woman with a boy in her arms and a girl tied to her back and a knife in her teeth, as if the gods might want to chisel her into something else and she would not stand for it. Behind them smoke thinned and lifted and then thickened and bellied, and sparks ran through it like tiny glowing rats going home. Down, Jon called. Here, if you can't carry it, throw it and we'll throw it again. There's soup. There was no soup. Jon was not a liar. He was a promise written down. The girl went up the goat path at a speed a goat would have respected. She did not draw a blade. The wolf stayed below and paced the waterline as if the sea had offended it personally. The first white slid from the smoke, not walking but sliding, like meat pulled free of a bone. It used its hands when it remembered and its elbows when it did not. It had been a man once with a fine gold ring on the middle finger of its left hand and a beard plate. Theon had not known men beyond the wall had rings. It was a thing to remember for later if later existed. He charged it like a smith charging a blade with water. The thing turned its head too slow to keep the axe from biting. When it dropped, it twitched until he took its head and kicked it away into the surf, and then thought, with a terrible clarity, that the sea would spit that up again in some child's future. A horn sounded above and to the east. The sound was wrong. Too steady, too clean, too patient. The wind turned once and the smoke moved off the cliff and the world went thinner and the shapes on the headland were visible. Row on row, like standing stones on a moor raised by a people too cold to bother with proper circles. They did not move with the ragged hunger of whites. They stood. Theon felt his throat tighten, not with fear but with the body's decision to make the air smaller to fit the fact. One of the shapes raised a spear that had no sheen to it and set it back on its foot and then took it up again as if measuring something. The others did nothing at all. That was worse. "Dragonglass," Jon said, not shouting because it would have wasted breath. Men like Mormont and Theon and those Iron Freethens did not wait for the word. They knew what had bitten them before and spit and bit back. The girl came down the goat path with a boy under each arm and dropped them like sacks into a man's arms at the bottom, and then turned without looking and went up again. Her breath smoked like a cooker. The wolf snarled, a low running growl that seemed made to say, "We have work." Theon felt the spear before he saw it. It came down from the headland with a leisurely care, and the air around it grew quiet as a church. He didn't think. He threw himself sideways and hit gravel hard enough to take hide off his forearms, and the spear went into the place where he had been with a sound like an icicle pushed through rotten wood. When it touched the driftwood, the fire along the rubbish hissed out. The pitch went from bright to blind in a breath. "Water?" Theon snapped, and men who had been holding skins moved as if a side of their bodies had been tugged with strings. "Don't waste it," Mormont said, as if there were two ways to fail at once and they had a map of both. He planted a broad-bladed knife into a thing that had been a woman and twisted, and the thing fell apart as if it had been waiting for permission. Melisandre stepped into the cleared space where Theon had been and raised her hands like a priest at a wedding. Theon felt every hair on his arms stand at once. The cliff whitewashed with light, not fire like wood in a grate, not fire like oil tossed down on men. Fire like sun behind his eyes. His vision went to snow and back, and the spear that had made the driftwood hiss steamed and ran as if ashamed. On the headland, the row of standing stones shifted its weight. Theon did not know if that was possible. He did not know if he had ever seen them move before, even now while he stared. One of them turned its head slowly, and the light that hit it went blue and then green and then nothing. The horn called again. It sounded like a thing that did not understand what the sound's shape ought to be and had decided it would make it anyway. The girl came down with another child, and this time when she turned, the spear went where her spine ought to have been. But there was a wolf there instead. It sprang with a blur that made the air long and grabbed the spear out of its own air with its teeth and shook it. The spear cracked like thick glass struck by a thrown stone. The thing on the headland lifted its head as if that had been surprising. The wolf spat the broken SPR over its shoulder, and the girl laughed. It was the noise Theon had made once when he had stolen a ship and found no one had followed because no one would dare. He felt it like a hand on his back pushing him forward. Jon never raised his voice, and Theon loved him for it because it made men want to hear him. "Back," he said. "Back in order. No running. We will carry who needs carrying. If a thing falls, you kick it into the water. If the water throws it back, you kick it again. If something with a crown of frost on its head looks at you, look back and show it you have no cleverness. Clever gets you killed today. Stubborn gets you home." They got men off the beach with a steadiness that would have made a Southron courtier write a song about it if Southron courtiers had ears for such. The spear took a shield and the arm under it, and the man who had been attached to both stared at the place where he had been larger a moment before and said, "Oh," and then nodded as if that were an acceptable division and walked down the last of the gravel with his mouth set. The girl's wolf moved at the edge of the waterline like a scythe. The things that slid in from the smoke kept coming, and the cliff overhead never got closer and the headland never got farther. But men went into boats and boats shoved off, and their weight put water between them and everything that had decided to dislike being dead. The last boat shoved off with half men and half people who had sworn oaths to no one and had knives they would not give up for the comfort of those rowing beside them. Theon was in that boat, and the girl and the wolf, and a man with scars and parallel stripes down both arms, and a boy who had not decided if he would lie yet when asked if he had ever killed anyone. The oars went in and out, slower than a heart, steady as one when it just does its job. Theon did not look back. He knew some men would. He knew some women would make themselves not. He knew that if he did, he would see the standing stones and hear the sound a man makes when the wind of another world hits his lungs, and he would carry that sound into dreams. He did not need more of those. Melisandre kept the light poised on the cliff long enough to make the next spear sheathed for a breath, and then let it go, and the world went ordinary, which in that place meant wrong. She collapsed like a piece of curtain. Jon caught her with an annoyance that had no malice in it. "Get us home," he said to Mormont, as if home were something a man could name. They did not lose a boat. When the line crawled back into the little cove below the shadow of the wall, men lifted oars with the exhausted jubilation of ones who had found out the water had decided, inexplicably, to allow them to live. They did not cheer. They moved as they had been told. Theon staggered in and dragged, and when the girl stumbled, he took her elbow and realized he had never thought he would do that in his life, help a Stark girl like a brother. His throat did its tight thing again, and he breathed through it and got her into the tunnel's steam and laughed when the wolf shook itself and doused both of them. "Soup," Jon said then, and this time there was soup. It had too much onion in it because that is what was in the sack a cook had been able to reach without moving other sacks, and no one minded. The wildlings slurped with the feral greed of men who had taught themselves again not to be polite in order to stay alive. Theon held his bowl, and the heat bled through his gloves, and he felt it in his wrists and up the channels of his bones. His hands trembled. He put the bowl down and watched them shake and let them. The girl sat down beside him without asking and leaned her shoulder into his. He realized he had been leaning on something and had thought it was a wall. "Ghost?" she said, and Theon looked up and saw the white shape in the doorway, the far door, because of course the beast would not come where men told him to. He would come where he needed to. The red eyes were calm as meat. Ghost stepped in and nosed the girl's forearm and then sneezed twice, the second time with dignity. "There you are," she said, and scratched his face where a scar had grown in like a white river. "He comes when he wants to," Jon said, sounding put upon and proud in the same mouth. "Like all of you. Like all of us," she agreed, and her smile now was not like a knife at all. When Alice Karstark stood before the heart tree in the Little Godswood at Castle Black, her hand in Sigorn's and her head up, it felt less like a marriage than like two rivers deciding to adjoin and make a third thing that would not fit in the old maps. After, Jon took Theon to the place beneath the tree where the snow never held long because the sap ran hot inside those old roots, and Theon knelt. The bark had faces if you wanted them. He watched the mouth of one and waited for it to move. It did not, and that was good. Men who heard trees speak usually needed sleep or something stronger. "You know the words," Jon said. "I know I said worse ones and lived," Theon answered and began. Words that tasted of ice and bone, and men who had starved rather than break them, and men who had broken them and been forgiven by none. He named brothers he had scarcely met, and a work he had only begun, and a night he would no longer try to cheat. He said he would not father a child, and the words had the peculiar comfort of a wound a man does not have to look at anymore. He said he would keep no lands and win no glory, and Theon understood why some men flinched there and why others sighed as if laying down a sack that had cut their shoulders. He finished and let the air go and felt nothing dramatic he could name. He was glad of that. He did not need thunder. The knife he had brought to his own neck seemed less heavy in his hand when he rose. Jon touched his shoulder. Not a king's touch, not an absolution, only the mark of a man who had been at the hard work longer than you and would share it if you showed up for it. It was enough. Theon put his palm on the heart tree, just once, and the sap under the bark felt like something a man could wait for. In Winterfell, a day later, Wyman Manderley was buried with more food than he would have approved of, which was to say enough to feed the town twice. When a southern sept tries to mourn, it enforces seriousness like a tax. The North's old gods are present in trees that do not care to be looked at, and men find their own measures. Wyman's measures were 12 pies, 2 whole boars, 6 barrels of ale, and a slow coffee made by singing the water hot for a long time and not letting it boil. Men laughed. Women told stories. Children ran and were caught and scolded and released. Davos stood with salt under his nails and listened to a woman he had not met cry into a handkerchief woven with eels, as if someone had told her the sea itself had gone under. Rickon stood under the gallery with Osha at his side and did not hide when he cried. He drank beer and made a face at it, and then drank more because the men he would lead drank and the women he would listen to drank, and a child who would lord had to drink and know not to gamble with the tongue you use on a cup. Stannis stood toward the back with one hand on his jaw and watched the business of a people sewing themselves back together with greasy fingers. Lady Dustin moved through the hall like a black sail when the wind had not yet been decided for the day, touching shoulders when it looked like pride would break and removing a cup when it looked like pride would drown. After, when the quiet came like a clean table, Stannis spoke to the assembled with the care of a man who knows he will not get to correct himself. "We go south," he said without preface. Not to make a show, to pull up a root. The phrase sat at the twins like rot. Men went there to pass and did not pass. They went there to eat and were put on the table. That is not governance. That is indulgence. I am done with it. Wylus Manderly, who had his father's hands and not yet his measure, lifted his chin. "We go to take revenge," he said, and Stannis's eye flickered like a man brushing away a fly. "You go because the river needs to be what it says it is," Stannis said. "Because those bridges make you liars when you name them. Because a house that kills guests is a house that kills itself, but sometimes it cuts its throat too slow and then men have to finish it." Rickon did not speak. He stared at the surface of a cup and watched his face wobble. Davos was at his shoulder. He leaned down and said something that made the boy snort. Osha nodded once, and Stannis saw it and let out a breath through his nose. "Sometimes the people you are asked to rule already have rulers. The trick is to let them rule up to the point where the frame holds." They marched in snow that sighed under the foot instead of shrieking, and that was the first good sign. They took roads as far as roads could be called that. Then they took tracks. Then they made their own. The river country lifted to meet them, slow and grudging, and then with sudden gifts. Men in patched cloaks came out of copses to stand on the edges of fields and nod and say nothing. Others came with what meat their house could spare, because houses in winter that did not spare meat died of pride. Stannis's foragers did not steal. They counted and left tokens scrawled with the antlered stag and a mark besides that had nothing to do with kings and everything to do with paying a debt after the thaw. Davos had given him that, and he had taken it because sometimes clever is not the enemy when it looks like fairness. The northern men approved, but only after watching. Approval given easily is a stone that schemes and never sinks. The twins rose out of the white like a pair of rotten teeth in a mouth too proud to admit it needs a surgeon. The river ran narrower and meaner in winter, hard at the sides and oil-black where it had kept moving as if out of spite. The Fry banners hung, washed out blue and drab gray, like rags hung out of a sick room. Stannis set his tents out of range and had a fire built with a stingy hand. He could have camped closer and shown contempt. He preferred to show long patience and let men in towers with bellies too soft tell themselves that meant he was slow. Slow was a story that made men sleep. Stannis liked men asleep if he could not have them bound. A line of riders came jouncing from the eastern bank, heads wrapped in furs that barely flattered them. Their leader, a ham-faced man with a mustache like a brush dipped in soup, reined in and made his horse back and come forward again. A little dance of authority for a crowd that had better things to do. He tugged at a glove and peered, as if trying to place faces in a bad light. His gaze skittered over Wylus Manderly with its calculations stuttering only slightly and then landed on Stannis as if on a nail. "King Stannis," he called, and Theon, standing among the line of men who had no name in this business but work, felt the words fall flat. "Lord Walder." The name made men on both sides of the water twitch and glance to skies. "Greets you and asks your business to be stated." Wylus's mouth opened and closed. Stannis did not let it open again. "Lord Walder is dead," he said. "If he has greeted me, I do not like the voice he has chosen. My business is to make men fit to pass and be welcome again on a road that has forgotten itself." The ham-faced man puffed, as if he had been planning to deliver a long speech and had just watched it fall into the river. "We are the bridge," he said weakly, as if he had practiced the words and the rhythm and now found the syllables heavier than he had expected. "You are a cost," Stannis replied, "one we will not pay as long as it is miscounted." Blackfish Tully came into the camp that dusk with 6 men and a smile that could have cut cheese. He had eaten little and saved his anger for the road and wore it like mail. He went through the lines as if he had built them in another life. He came to Stannis's small fire and stood with the posture of an old tree that had weathered a dozen storms and meant to weather a dozen more. "You took your time," he said. "I measured it," Stannis said, and Robert Blackfish Tully laughed, short and like old iron banged by a hasty smith. "That's the first honest thing a king said to me since I was 10, he said, and sat down without being asked. "I have folk in the reeds who will be glad to open a second door when you set your boot between that gate and its jamb." Wylis's hands tightened and loosened. "We'll build a gibbet for each stair," he said, and Davos put a hand on his wrist without looking, the way a sailor puts a hand on a pot when the galley tilts. Wylis breathed out. "We'll build them after," he conceded. They took the twins by daylight because deceit is a tool like any other, and sometimes it is more useful to put it away. They moved at a walking pace that made men on the towers lean over their crenels and squint, then look back to shrug at those behind them. Men in blue on the walls laughed with their hands against their bellies so as not to show how thin the belts had got. The men in the towers joked about the cold and were not wrong. Then the reeds spit men up, wet and silent, into the drip shadow under the western span, and a rope went up and men went up after it. On the eastern bank Stannis's small engines. He had dragged them over ground that clutched at them like a child, thumped with the homey rhythm of a siege done by folk who understood the value of careful bruising. The stones they threw were not big enough to make songs, but big enough to make men in towers duck and break the lovely brave line in their shoulders. And when the line is broken, the day gets inside. Wylis Manderly was the first over the western parapet and the second to cut his hand. The first man to cut his hand was a fry who had not yet been told he would never again get to put it on a woman's waist with any confidence. He squealed as if that would sharpen his blade. It only made Manderly's men glance and then take him under. Davos came behind Wylis with a hook and parried a sword with the hook in a way the man who wielded the sword had plainly never seen before. He looked offended and fell down. The men in the towers began to notice that the men under them were inside their house. They tried to make their mouths shape new commands. Their mouths had old commands in them. The old commands were not wrong, but the timing was. By the time Stannis's engines broke a low gate and a flood of northerners poured through like good ale through a clean spigot, the Freys were half en route and half in a rage, so muddled they could not decide which of those halves they were attached to. Men tripped on stairs and made more men trip on them, and then someone's pot of stew went over and scalded 6 who had not yet drawn and 3 who had, and no one took care to avoid the pot because the pot had fed them last night and they felt that counted against it. Blackfish opened a little postern on the eastern lane by the pigeon coops, and a dozen Riverlanders slipped in with their mouths open and teeth showing. Wylis drove them toward the middle and never shouted. Stannis never raised his sword above his shoulder. He was too tired for theater. When the gates were barred from within and the bridge was a silent thing that no longer creaked with men running upon it without knowing where they ran, Wylis Manderly stood in the great hall with its smoke-stained rafters and looked at the long table where men had eaten the deaths of other men and set his knife in it, hard up to the hilt. The wood took it, perhaps because it had taken worse. "Bring the old men," Stannis said, his voice carrying like an account read aloud. "Bring the ones who knew and smiled. Bring the ones who did not smile and did not stop it. Bring the ones who washed the platters because they were told to and would have washed any platter set before them. Bring them all and we will show them the sum. If there are 1 or 2 who raise their chins, we will lower them. If there are 1 or 2 who weep for what they did not do because they fear the world they will be in without a phrase bread to keep them from hunger, I will listen to what they have to say and then decide." "Decide what?" Wylis asked, as if he had forgotten that decision can be work and wanted to taste it. "Whether mercy trims this hedgerow well," Stannis said. He sat, then, at the long table and rubbed at his jaw as if it ached. He looked up once, as if he had meant to say something kinder, and then let it drop like a man who knows the words will sound as if he had stolen them. "Do it," he said. The springs of the twins ran brown for 3 days with the washing out of the kitchens. Men with harsh hands scrubbed grease from boards that had held perfidy and found that it did not come out easily. That was well. Mercy did some trimming, but not much. Names were nailed onto a wall with simple curses, and men who had worn those names badly swung below. Songs were not made. The river moved on, grateful perhaps for new fish, and the bridges groaned in a way that sounded like relief. News runs along the bones of a land in winter faster than feet do. Sansa heard in the eyrie and tucked her mouth inward for a day and spoke little to the man who had named himself her guardian. Peter Baelish watched her with the greedy patience of a cat who had yet to decide whether a bird is worth the domesticity of being fed and thinks perhaps the bird could be both. He brought her cakes sugared with snow and talked of ports. He put a glove on a page's shoulder and steered him the way one steers a rumor. He smiled when men smiled at him, and he did not when they did not, and it did not unman him. Sansa went to the snow garden and built a SM. All wall whose crenels had the exact spacing of the ones in Winterfell's memory. When the steward with his pinched lips came to say the Lord Protector wished for her to join him for discourse upon the state of the river roads, she nodded and took off her gloves with careful tugs and went and sat with an expression of a girl trying to embroider and told the man who had thought himself cleverer than gods that the north had wolves again, and the Vale would either come when called like a hawk or be remembered as a bird that decided feathers mattered more than meat. It was a courtesan's answer in a soldier's language. Baelish liked it and did not like it. He admired the workmanship. He disliked the house it belonged to. He decided later because that is what he had taught himself to do while other men spent the coin in their pockets. In the Iron Islands, Asha took back a tower with 10 men and a bluff, and in the process took back something she had lost of herself and washed it in salt water and let it dry in wind. She went to a great hall that had once been her uncle's and stood in it and pitched her voice to the stone and did not mention her father's name. She told men with fish in their teeth that the world beyond their storms was gathering itself, and if they did not want the scraps they should come now to a table and bring something of their own. A few laughed. More did not. She smelled a crow's eye on the wind and knew he would come as soon as he found a better stage than the wet wood under his feet. She sharpened blades and ordered men to wrap the hilts in leather that would not shale away when they got wet, and thought, not for the first time, that the work she now did was what she had thought she would always do, only it had a weight to it she had not expected and found she preferred. She wrote a letter with her hand cramped from too many days at sea and sent it to Winterfell with a man who had memorized it in case the letter itself went overboard or into his stomach. The letter said simply, "We will not raid the north this winter. Tell the men who count fish to count also those we caught and return to their own shores. And in the spring we will speak in a hall and not on a deck." At the wall, Theon took a patrol out along the line of old watchfires with the girl and 2 men from the Shadow Tower who had never learned to keep a joke in their own mouths. The snow lay thin like shame. The wind had dropped, and sometimes that was worse. It meant sounds carried. They found tracks, not of men and not of wolves. Something with hooves but not hooves. The marks in the snow had a sort of thought in them. Theon put his palm to one and felt the cold bounce up into his arm through the old wrong in his wrist like a bell rung. At the top of a small rise, under a clutch of birches that had forgotten to bend south to the light years ago and so stood like rebels, they found 3 bodies. One had been a boy, one had been a woman, one had been a thing that wore armor once. The boy had blue on his mouth. The woman had a knife in her hand, and there were small brown hairs in the crease of her palm, where she had clutched it so hard the skin had peeled when she fell. The armored thing had no head. The girl knelt by the boy and used 2 fingers to close his lids. Took 2 tries. The lids were stiff as old leather. She did not sniffle. She stood and looked north and said, "Bran." Theon felt it then as a whisper along a new-made wall in him that he had not known was up. The edge of a thought that was not his. Ravens went up from trees a 1/4 mile away and turned as if answering a call. The world shivered, the way a pond does when something under the skin of it moves. It wasn't Melisandre's heat. It wasn't Ghost's cool. It was something older. Theon did not like wizards, but he had learned to not prefer his own charity in the face of a work he could not do. He slid his glove off and put his hand on the nearest birch and waited, willing himself not to demand. He did not hear words. He saw for a breath, a hall of roots and eyes and blood that did not drip. He tasted copper. He pulled his hand back and dared a laugh. "What did you see?" the girl asked. She had set her jaw, as if the answer were something she had chosen before. "A boy," he said, because it was the truth, "with leaves in his hair, and wolves that were not wolves." She nodded and let her breaths go. "He is fine," she said anyway, "because sometimes you speak the truth that has not happened yet to make it real. He is fine and full of men's old stories. If he could climb now, he would climb into the sky and kick it to see if it would hold." "It might," Theon said. "It might put a boot back through his belly." "He'd laugh then too," she said, and the wolf leaned against her legs so hard she had to take a step to keep her balance. When they turned back for the wall, the wind rose with the irritating insistence of a boy who has run out of questions and has decided to ask them again in a different order. Theon's nose ran and he wiped it with the back of his glove and felt the salt freeze. He thought of the salt of pike and almost tripped. He had spent most of his life thinking he could outrun the smell of home. He had settled for learning which homes smelled worse and standing in them when the wind blew the other way. A wooden tooth in the heel of his boot clicked. He had fixed it himself badly and had put off letting a better hand do it. He decided to go to the hammerer in the yard whose pitch he liked and ask for help. He filed that away with other work and smiled at himself because the smile was not cruel. The woman from Carhold came down with her men at noon with an escort of thens and a little flag on a stick that made the men who wanted to chase and haul her back grind their teeth. They did not like thens. They did not like anything that did not obey the rules of a chair and a hall. They followed anyway at a distance that would let Hem lie later about what they had meant to do. She went to Winterfell with the speed of someone who has learned that running is not always the right pace. She brought with her a notice that the North meant to know its daughters again, and the daughters meant to know the work they had, and the men who had meant to make them forget would be taught to remember. Carhold had thought it would be given a broad back to climb upon and a breast to suckle its greed, and would be permitted to call that honor. It was given a new lord with a scar on her face, and a husband who had learned how to shave in a reflective blade, and 2 wolves, and a letter with Stannis Baratheon's seal that had not been broken. Carhold took all of it and did not balk over much. Hunger makes men pliable and kitchens thick with women stern. Carhold's kitchens had those. Sometimes a house is saved by the people who never sit at table. Arya went south when the snow let the road show its humps. She wore a hood that made her a nobody and a tone in her voice that made men think twice before bothering to test that. The wolf went where it wanted and came back when it wished. Ghosts sometimes went with them and sometimes did not. Jon looked at her and wanted to forbid and made his mouth do other work. She went down through a world that had been frightened into quiet and came up at last under Winterfell stones with a face that had learned to hide its tellings. Rickon saw her and went still as a post. Osha had hands on both his shoulders and she did not take them away. She only loosened them. They stared at one another with the ferocity of children who have survived all the wrong things and are not sure the thing in front of them is not another wrong thing in a good mask. Arya took 2 steps. Rickon took 1. The wolf came in at an angle and pushed both children with its body in a way that made adults in the yard look for an axe. Then laugh, then hide the laugh because a moment like that is a coin with too bright a face. Arya put both hands on Rickon's head and Rickon went into her ribs like a little storm and put his forehead there and stayed. A sound like wind in leaves went around the yard and up into the trees and back down. Osha wiped at her nose with the heel of her hand and said something foul and turned away and grinned behind her palm. Stannis watched it from the parapet with Davos at his shoulder. "Do you suppose the gods approve?" he asked, and it was not a scoff, only a question with no hope in it. "I suppose the gods like their trees and their rivers working," Davos said. "Children doing children's business is better than old men doing worse." Stannis said, as if that merited thought. "They'll fight like bears," Davos added, "but not about chairs. They'll fight about truths and how they're told," Stannis said. "That's worse." He did not sound as if he minded. He sounded as if he had decided he would be present for it. Lady Dustin came to the heart tree that evening with a wolfhound that had begun to gray and a bottle with no label and 2 cups. She found Arya sitting on her heels with her back against the bark, as if she had found the one back in the world that did not need watching. Lady Dustin poured without asking and held the cup out. Arya took it without ceremony, sniffed, and drank with the face of a girl whose first taste of wine had once been stolen from the detained attention of a groom with a pretty mouth and a loose hand. She spluttered and laughed and put a thumb up to wipe the spill. Lady Dustin did not smile, but her eyes softened in their corners. "I knew your father," she said. "He had a talent for being better than he announced. It made men forgive the rest." "He was the best I knew," Arya said, simply. "But I never knew all that much, so maybe that doesn't matter." "It matters," Lady Dustin said, "but it matters differently than men say. I did not come to tell you tales. I came to tell you not to let kitchen women under your skin with their stories about how a house is run. Spend time there. Learn their names. Do not let them make nests in you. You are not a nest. You are a storm." "I know," Arya said, "but storms need houses to kill, or else they exhaust themselves on nothing." Lady Dustin lifted her cup. "You'll do," she said, and drank. When night came, a proper night with long patience and honest cold, Theon stood on Winterfell's wall again with his elbows on stone that had been old when the first of his wrongs had been only a thought he had decided not to think. He looked north and saw the little smudge of light that marked a watch fire along the road to the wall. He looked south and saw a darker dark that meant the world had decided for a time to be quiet. He thought of his list, the one he had left behind and the one he still kept. He thought of the names on it that had been crossed out by snow. He thought of the names that would be crossed out by fire. He thought of his own and how it would end, on a wall or in a bed or on a field with nothing to show for it but cooling blood and a clean knife. He did not mind. He minded only the work. He minded only the next thing to be done. In the rookery, a raven hopped along a beam and made a sound like laughter and then like a door closing and then like a name. It did not matter which. It was all the same word in the end when put in a mouth that has learned to say what it means and mean it. Dawn found them in the yard with steam rising off horses and men grumbling like kettles. Stannis was mounted and impatient. Davos rode with an awkward care that said he had learned to sit a horse the way he had learned to walk on decks, by letting the thing under him do what it meant to do and not asking more. Arya and Rickon sparred with blunted sticks near the well and insulted each other with an invention saved for family. Osha sat on the wellhead and did not interfere, which is as much mothering as most boys need to turn out proper. Lady Dustin's wolfhound slept with its head on its paws. Wylus Manderly shouted something unnecessary and laughed when men ignored it. Theon drank something that stung his throat and pounded his chest and laughed at himself for the coughing it provoked. He liked the taste of his own foolishness. Tasted better than the old kinds. A rider came in on a dun that had lost a shoe and did not mind. Some horses chose their riders, and this one had chosen a man who never complained. The rider's cloak was spattered with road, and his beard held icicles like ornaments. He slid down, stumbled, caught himself, caught his breath instead of wasting it speaking too soon, and handed Davos a roll of oilskin without looking at Stannis. That was a man who had learned that when you want a job done right, you deliver it to the man who keeps lists of nails. Davos unwrapped with his neat fingers and read with his mouth. He didn't make a sound. His eyes moved. He handed it to Stannis with his brow creased like a sail about to be reefed. Stannis read, and the muscle in his jaw moved once. He handed it back and looked at the heart tree beyond the yard as if it had asked him the wrong question. "So," he said. "So, what?" Wylus demanded, angry in advance at news that might compel him to be less theatrical. "Dragons," Davos said, without any of the awe men elsewhere put in their mouths when naming them. "Stannis, they've come out of stories and into ships again," Stannis said. "A girl with too much fire has sailed toward men who do not know the terms of that heat. We will have to count that in. And here," Davos added, tapping the lower line of the letter, where the ink had bled like blood in a snowdrift, "men south say lions have claws again. The boy with too much gold in his hair sits a chair too big for him and argues with a woman who thinks the chair hers. They squabble and the spiders spin while they do. "I do not have time for children," Stannis said, which was a thing he said often and which meant more often than he would have admitted. He looked at his men. "We go to Moat Cailin. We go to Barrows. We go to the place where I can stand and make the rest of them line up because they remember how. We go to men who know what a winter looks like and do not need to be told not to wet their small clothes every time it howls. The rest can play at summer a little longer." "And then?" Davos asked. "And then we turn," Stannis said. He looked north. He always did. "We have 2 winters to fight and only 1 storehouse to load." The work resumed because it must. The roads were not straighter, but feet wore them true. Houses that had forgotten their debts remembered. Men who had learned to ask their knives for favors taught their tongues to do more. The heart tree watched and bled as it had since men had done stranger things under it. The wolves ran. The water moved under ice. Theon took his watch and then the next and then the next. He looked out beyond the world and saw only what he could do the day after this one, and counted that enough to set his feet down and pick them up again. When the wind rose like a beast and tore at everything with teeth made of air, they bent into it and laughed. When the first blue spark flared far beyond the wall at a place a map named and men called Cold, a raven launched, and another, and another. They came like pieces of night torn loose, and they settled in Winterfell and White Harbor, and on the mast of a ship off Pike, and on the crenel of a keep above the Trident, and on the hats of men in market squares who had come to sell poor apples and good rope. Each bird made the same sound with different throats. It was not a word any man had been taught. It meant up. It meant look. They did. And above, under the skirl and snarl and low moan, beyond even the loftiest of men's halls and the highest of their small opinions, the aurora went up over the far edge of the world like a banner of green fire a god had torn from its grieving shoulders and hung for men to be brave by.